What I'm going to try to do is really just walk with you some personal reflections on how I see security in Africa today, and share with you a few thoughts at the end about how I see U.S. policy, how it has been, and where it should be in dealing with security in Africa. This is a very challenging subject because the continent is extremely big. I mean, oftentimes we talk about Africa and mentally one gets the impression of some little place, monolithic, all kinds of similarities and so on. But when you begin to delve into it, you very quickly realize it's a very, very complex continent, 55 countries, a huge population. The size, I didn't realize this until not too long ago, the Mercator projection actually doesn't do justice to Africa. It looks a lot smaller on the map. So many different dynamics in conflict-related issues in the continent. So there is always a risk when you try to give an overview of anything about Africa. Half of what you say may be correct, the other half is probably going to be wrong. So bear with me when I do that. We don't have too much time, so I'm going to try to be rather brief in doing so. In preparing for this talk, I was struck by a number of almost diametrically opposed perspectives on Africa more generally, but more specifically on security. There are those who say the continent has been at crisis for a very long time. It continues to dominate the news on instability and conflict, and there's very, very little hope at all for Africa. I was trying to look here for an article that I was looking at, and it struck me as rather strong. This is in the national interest. It says the wars ravaging Africa in 2016. And if you look at it from that perspective, probably not too terribly wrong, because you have Sudan, South Sudan, Central African Republic, DRC, Burundi boiling up, and so on and so on. So one immediately reading the news, and of course the news typically reports on the negative. You walk out of there saying, that is a bad place. Really, really terrible things are happening there. On the other hand, there are those who have been talking about the 21st century being the century of Africa, highest rate of economic growth in the world, the place to be, and so on and so on. And yet in the middle, there are people who talk about, say, well, yes, the news from Africa is not very good, but if you really think about it, it is concentrated in a few hotspots. You have Nigeria and Boko Haram going into Niger, some parts of Cameroon, and possibly Chad. That's one region. There you can add a bit about Mali. Then you have the Central Africa region, with Central Africa dominating the news and some really unpleasant things happening there. And then you move to the Horn of Africa. You find South Sudan and Somalia, really, really bad situations. But beyond that, the rest of the continent is moving on. Things are stable. I'll leave that up to you to judge. This is just to say, to illustrate how complex it is sometimes in doing so. And of course, each one of those dynamics have somewhat different relations to it. What I want to do before I get into some of the quick points I wanted to make about conflict in Africa is just take a walk across, and I'll divide Africa into the typical sub-regions. Southern Africa, Western Africa, Central Africa, Eastern Africa, and then North, just to give you a snapshot. And this we can do together. Starting with Southern Africa. When you look at the Southern Africa region, the countries there, of course, South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Zambia and Malawi, Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, Mauritius, and Madagascar. There may be one or two I'm missing there. What comes to mind about security in the region? Some people argue that the Southern Africa region is really one of the most stable ones. It hasn't had too many problems, other than Mugabe being a bit of a rascal out there and really creating some instability, and we're very anxious about how things might happen there. You have Dos Santos in Angola. He has been there for decades and is getting his family into all of the key positions in government. Some latent tensions, but maybe not really bubbling up, not surfacing. Of course, Angola also has a history of civil war that was very nasty, and they continue to struggle with that. Mozambique had a history of civil war. It was stable for a while, and for a long time, people used to say, classical example of how best to do conflict resolution and to mediate. Now, of course, you know that Mozambique is not that happy anymore. Frelimo and Renamo are going at each other. There are some rebel movements happening in that southern part, in different parts of Mozambique. They've actually almost literally split up the country. Mauritius is the best story. Mauritius and Seychelles, they are very quiet. Seems to be democracy is moving, economy is progressing reasonably well, and so on. Zambia and Malawi, I think, are on a reasonably decent track. Zambia has had several democratic elections. Malawi had a very tense period after the death of the former president, but they managed to overcome that. The biggest issue in Malawi is the question of poverty and just how deep it is creating problems. Zambia, I think they have had some issues with xenophobia lately, going after Africans from different parts of the country, particularly Rwandese. But by and large, the biggest issue in Zambia, I think, today is socioeconomic problems and issues related to the economy and worsening socioeconomic conditions. So that's Southern Africa. I think by and large, somewhat stable. I didn't mention South Africa. South Africa is a very tricky place because 20 years almost after the end of apartheid, there are really, really serious tensions boiling up in the country. We've had serious problems with xenophobia. Lots of Africans in the country, and every so often it flares up and there's tremendous violence against them. You have President Zuma with these serious issues of corruption, and really the state is becoming at question. But the biggest issue in South Africa is probably the unfulfilled expectations of the majority black population. And it's creating a lot of agitation, and they are quite angry. And I think the main concern is the transition into the next phase of democratization in South Africa is going to be extremely tricky. And the fact that the ANC is so dominant over the years since independence, literally, is not a very positive story for South Africa. Let me move briefly to Western Africa. And pardon me for doing this. I'm doing it rather deliberately because I really think that, as I said at the beginning, sometimes when we paint these very broad brushes, we miss out on some of the details and intricacies and what it is that make some of the conclusions that we are drawing. Western Africa had been extremely tense for a very long time. It's unclear now whether when you look at the trajectory, it is stable, worsening, or improving. But the main story there is obviously Nigeria with Boko Haram and the spillover of the conflict of the Boko Haram issue into Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. Nigeria also has some issues in the eastern part with the oil issue and tensions among some of the people in southeastern Nigeria who really believe that they have been terribly marginalized and are not terribly included in the government. In fact, President Buhari was supposed to go to that part of Nigeria. Was it yesterday, a couple of days ago? He had to cancel it, primarily because I think he's unsure how to handle the problem in that part of Nigeria. So there are bubbling tensions, very big population. On the democracy front, I think Nigeria seems to have come to terms with how it deals with the tension between north, south, east, and so on, in the pattern in which power is handed over from one regime to another, but it remains a very tense area. Mali is a mess. For a long time, I think almost all of us here were very positive about Mali. You know, you had a military leader handed over to civilians. He was then elected, became president. He was a darling of the ACSS, actually, Toumani Touré. I remember when I was here, we used to fly him all over the place to talk about civil-military relations and how the military relates to civilians and so on. And we missed out completely on the fact that the country was actually breaking apart. There was a tremendous amount of corruption, drug trafficking, and all kinds of things. And when it imploded, everybody was in a state of shock. How did we miss Mali? And it remains so. In fact, in one of the articles I was looking at recently, what they were saying was that Mali is just being held together by the international community and donor money, and that the elites have been so totally out to lunch that they have no clue what is going on and probably will not be in a position to reasonably address the problem in the country. Niger just had an election, president re-elected, I don't know how many terms he has been in the office, manipulated as many others have done, and changed the constitution to stay on. One of the biggest security threats in the region, and I'll get back to that very quickly at the end, these leaders who want to stay on forever and changing constitutions and so on. And of course, when you combine that with failure to deliver on social services, a lot of anger and frustration and the youth bulge, it creates for a very, very tense situation in a country. Burkina Faso, again, very much along that line, Compaoré tried to play games with the constitution. The public didn't agree to it. Military took over very briefly. They recently had an election, and it's anybody's guess which way it is going to go. But I think what it represents, again, is the same story of the problem with democratic transition and how you move forward. Kofi, are you from Ghana? Yeah, okay, maybe you can tell us a little bit about Ghana. Ghana has had a reasonably decent history after a very tumultuous period in the 60s and 70s. They had elections. It has gone well. My good friend, also another friend of ACSS, Kofi Addo, challenged the election results, but they went to court and he has been quiet about it. But I sense that there are a lot of tensions in Ghana because of the economy. You still have some issues back and forth up there, which is a theme I talk about a lot here because it actually is an issue across the whole of the continent. Even countries that are politically somewhat more stable have exactly the same kinds of issues with the economy, with inability to fulfill the desires of the people, failure to meet basic social services, which then begin to play on some latent issues about ethnicity and regionalism and so on, and it can become explosive at any point in time. Things could break down in a country like that. Benin is considered probably reasonably more stable. They've had reasonably okay elections, although the economy remains a problem. Togo, again, a classical problem where the son of Eyadema is entrenching himself in and is not about to leave power anytime soon, and that is indeed also an issue of concern. And then there's Guinea. Guinea has been in turmoil for a very long time. The opposition and the majority have not really been able to come to terms with each other on how to establish a reasonably decent political system. And again, most people who look at Guinea are very concerned that failure to manage that political tension, and you combine that with a rather repressive history for a long period of time where there was a big outlash against opposition parties, makes Guinea a very unstable area in a region that has not been very, very stable. Of course, I haven't mentioned here Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, all in West Africa. All three have had some serious civil war issues. They are transitioning and moving on okay. Liberia is a very tricky place because Ellen Johnson, again, used to be a darling of ACSS. We flew her all over the place at one point in 1999, 2000. I'm making this point very deliberately, by the way, because in some ways, these are indications that the US and other Western powers flag somebody like Toumani Touré, Ellen Johnson, and said, that is the person we want to be the head of state. And we work hard to try to support them. But ultimately, what you begin to see then is that whether it is ATT in Mali or Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, who, by the way, has impeccable credentials. This is a woman, fantastic educational qualifications, was head of the Africa Bureau at UNDP for many years, very strong democratic credentials. But once you put her in power, you begin to see all of exactly the same kinds of symptoms. She has had her son as the head of the securities, another son as chief of the minerals and the department that deals with rare, valuable resources in the country. Another one was deputy governor of the central bank. And so they have phenomenal issues with corruption and so on. They have an election coming up very soon. And there's a tremendous amount of worry about what might happen. We may end up with a former warlord actually being a president in Liberia. Sierra Leone seems to be doing a little bit better in that regard. Again, we don't have too much time to get into this. I'll leave it there. I go to Central Africa. Very interesting. Probably one of the most tumultuous parts of Africa, dominated by the Central African Republic, with the tension between the Muslims and the majority. They just had an election recently. Religion remains a very tense issue of division between the various communities. There's a peacekeeping mission here. Nobody knows which direction that country is going to go, although it appears a little bit quiet now. It has been in the news a lot. Cameroon gives you a false sense of stability. President Biya isn't he the longest serving African leader? Yeah, it's been there forever. And one characteristic with all these guys who stay in power for that long is you have obviously a very, very poor governance system, extremely restrictive, they're very repressive, high level of corruption. All things that do not make up for good, stable transition at all politically. And it's the same with Biya. He stays in power simply because he learns how to manage all of this, which is not good because the Cameroonian people are not going to obviously sit down and take it easy. Chad has had a very difficult time, but again, a similar symptom where Idriss Déby, I don't think, is keen on leaving power anytime soon. Equatorial Guinea, they also just had an election, very common theme, farcical elections in many cases. Nguema was re-elected. He's also consolidating power around himself a lot, and then you have Gabon. Burundi, I'm not sure whether to put it in this region. Should I go on again with this? Well, I have two more, so I'll just make it very quickly. Eastern Africa. I said Central Africa was the worst, but I mean, maybe when you think about it again, Eastern Africa could be a bit more troubling. Because there you have Eritrea that is in a world of its own. A lot of the refugee issues that you hear about, there was an article a couple of days ago in the paper that Eritrea had the largest number of people fleeing the country in that list next to Syria and Libya among the refugees trying to cross over into Europe. And the reason is simply because Isaias Afwerki has just gone haywire for a very long time. Perhaps one of the most intimidating, repressive countries in the whole of Africa. Extremely repressive and controlling. It doesn't brook any kind of dissent and is ruthless with its opponents in the country. But then you move from Eritrea, Somalia, you know the story. I don't need to tell you much more than that. It has been there for a very long time. Djibouti is very quiet. Eritrea, another friend of the US. Meles was not a very democratic person. But the party has also made sure that his successor was in place. The economy is doing very well, but they have a lot of internal tensions with the Oromia Front and others, very unhappy with the political situation in the country, feeling marginalized, and so on and so on. Kenya, you know the story from the elections in 2007. Kenya, again, was one of those countries where we kind of thought, you know, it's reasonably stable. Moi had controlled it for a very long time. But the economy was doing well. It's a very vibrant country. But suddenly when in 2007 they were going to that elections and there was this brutal inter-ethnic fighting in the country that led to the deaths of thousands, I think it jolted us quite a bit. So what is going on in this country? Did we miss something? Again, you will see this is another theme in going across the continent. The political tensions continue. Raila Odinga, who is the head of the opposition, is determined that the political direction is not very good. And unfortunately, Mr. Kenyatta is learning from President Museveni and beginning to really reinforce the police forces, not with the interest of, in some ways, if you will, defending the sovereignty of Kenya, but to consolidate himself in position in power. And just a week ago, went out against demonstrating civilians and killed quite a few on the streets. Kenya, of course, is also very well known for the Al-Shabaab issue. They've been attacked several times, and at any given point in time, there's a lot of concern in Kenya that there may be another attack coming up anytime soon. Somalia, South Sudan, where I spent a couple of years, is, I don't know which country takes the prize for the wars between Central African Republic, Somalia, and Sudan, South Sudan. But all very, very, very difficult situations. And South Sudan, the former vice president has just come back now. The prognosis is not very good in South Sudan about how things look. I left my home country, Uganda, for last. Uganda is in a very dire situation. Museveni is into his 30 years now. He just was inaugurated again a week or so ago. You may remember from the news story that the US delegation walked out of the inauguration when he started being a bit nasty in his speech. The big problem with Uganda is with the democratic transition. And Museveni, Isaias Afwerki, Robert Mugabe, all these are the former liberators who somehow feel like they have an entitlement to run these countries. They don't like to strengthen or develop institutions. They're extremely repressive in the way they deal with their populations. And Museveni has actually been very good at his public relations. It is only now that the world outside is beginning to see that, in fact, democracy is not taking hold in Uganda, and that the future doesn't look very, very good. Northern Africa, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco. The main issues there, I think, are in Egypt, with a lot of the internal strife, the Muslim Brotherhood and the tensions, and I think you here know a lot more than I do about that. I will not get into it a lot, but Egypt is very unstable. Libya, of course, has been in total meltdown for quite a while now. Tunisia had probably one of the better records in terms of transitioning from the Ben Ali regime to democracy. But lately, I think there have been a lot of internal tensions, and also beginning to see the Islamist forces taking root in the country and creating their goal, as they say it, is to make Tunisia ungovernable and to go back to some sort of an Islamist regime. So makes for a lot of tension in the country. Sorry for that very long journey, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot and to lead really to my next point, on which I'll try to be very brief. As you look at this overall picture, what is your sense of the nature of security threats in Africa? Forget about, does it look positive, not so positive? Is it going well, not going well? What are the key security threats in Africa? I try to be very deliberate sometimes in getting into details here and there as I looked across. But let me sum it up in maybe 7 or 8 things, key themes that, in my view, really tell us a little bit about the story of security in Africa. First is what I call the unfinished project of nation building. Many, if not most, African countries were creatures of colonialism. Boundaries were drawn at the Berlin Conference. They didn't take into account ethnicity, ethnic boundaries, and so on. The logic was mostly the logic of colonialism. That put a lot of people together who perhaps have some tensions and not necessarily very easy fits. The boundaries were left untouched at independence, and under the Organization of African Unity, African countries said, you know what, this is the legacy we have, let's stay with it. But of course, it has left them with some very, really serious, challenging issues. On top of that, in many, many of these countries, the colonial powers deliberately tried to ensure that the communities never really tried to forge a sense of national identity. We don't have time to get into that history, but both the British and the French were very deliberate in that regard, in making sure that the ethnic groups were left at tension. And in fact, as I like to say about Nigeria, Uganda, and a few others, they left us with some very, very negative stereotypical views of each other. You know, if you go to Uganda, a person in southern Uganda will say, there is no way I'll let those northerners rule us, because they were given the impression the northerners are not that smart. They are rather violent people, less civilized and what have you than them. On the other hand, the northerners will say, well, you know, I wouldn't let a southerner run this country because they are devious people, not very straightforward, dishonest, and so on and so on. Those things have lingered on. And so the project of nation building has been very challenging. It doesn't explain everything, but it really does tell you a lot about why, in many, many ways, unless something is done to try to deliberately work on forging this sense of nationhood, it is going to be challenging. And of course, then it leaves us in many, many cases with situations where our allegiance is more to our ethnic group rather than to the nation, because the nation means nothing to me. It means very, very little, in fact, beyond the flag and the national anthem. I have no reason to particularly identify with that, especially if you take into account the fact that the government in power tended to be oriented, and it's still happening today, more towards its ethnic members. Actually starts with the family, then the neighborhood, and so on. And so the rest of us feel marginalized. We feel like I'm not part of this political community. And that theme has continued today. And in fact, if you look at the majority of the conflicts in Africa, it boils down to this fact, not in isolation. The second is historical legacy. I think I've already touched upon that. You have colonialism, then you had the Cold War, where the two major powers were actually playing around, didn't pay too much attention to the issue of democracy or countries forging together. And we ended up then with situations where nobody paid attention to political developments in country. That was followed very quickly in the late 60s, early 70s with military dictatorships. Military administrations that stayed on for long, and they consolidated some very, very negative tendencies of intolerance and repressiveness and so on. And that hasn't really gone away, because as I was going through, you'll recall that a lot of the military leaders put on different uniforms. They are now going through elections, and they do everything to manipulate those elections so they can stay in power. Institutions were also not built. So what you have ended up with are situations where you don't have the institutions to mediate political differences or to ensure that the state is doing what it is supposed to, do. The third is this phenomenon of liberators. I've talked about that already. You had that in Meles, in Kagame, in Museveni, in Mugabe, and so on. They fought wars of liberation either against colonial administration or against military dictatorships. And people like Museveni vowed at one point, we shall never allow this dictatorship to continue. And of course, every one of us loved that. But the moment they stepped in, for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, they themselves turned into dictators. They have a sense of entitlement. Museveni likes to tell this story. He takes it back to the local native level. And when you catch him on a good day, he says, look, how can you tell a guy who has gone out to hunt? He has shot his deer, he brings it home, and when it's time to eat it, you tell him to leave it alone for other people to eat. That doesn't make sense. So for him, Uganda is like a prize. He has won it, he must keep it, and perhaps pass it on to his children. He just promoted his son, by the way, to a major general and made him the head of the Presidential Guard unit that is now in charge of, actually separated it from the military also, from the normal structure of the military. But the liberators are a breed on their own, and there are quite a few of them around. Then you have the issue of democratic transitions. Military dictatorships and what we were trying to go through democracy, the majority of them have accepted the idea of democracy. Yes, we'll democratize. But democratic transition has been extremely treacherous for Africa. And as you look across some of the more tense areas, you have several related phenomena here where the guy in power doesn't want to leave. He does everything to try to stay on. Politics is a zero-sum game. Because getting into power means political power, it means access to all of the resources of the country, it means having the military behind you and so on. And so we fight it to the death, because that election will determine your fate in the country. The person in power, obviously, by the way, the Museveni case, I'm not just ragging on him because I come from Uganda and I don't like the way things are going, but he also embodies exactly the pattern that all of them use. Security infrastructure is not there for the defense of the country. It is used for purposes of regime sustenance and power. He also makes sure that the security system, the security institutions in the country are not unified. This is part of the reason why he created what is called, it used to be called the Presidential Guards. Now I think they call it Special Forces. You don't know for what the purpose is. Put his son in charge of it, institutionally separated it from the rest of the military. So you really have no idea which institution. But the primary purpose is to ensure that if there is any kind of opposition in the country at all, he will crush it to ensure that he stays in power. And I think that partly explains why we have these very serious issues with democratic transitions. Then there's the discordant development. If you look at World Bank statistics, Africa is developing. The rate of growth is reasonably impressive. GDP per capita growth is looking okay. But the reality is that the number of people in poverty and the depth of poverty is worsening every single day. Almost every single country has horrendous economic situations. The majority of the population has no access to all of these wonderful the fruits of economic development. And in particular, when you take into account the fact that Africa is the youngest population in the world. The overwhelming majority of the people are under 30. They feel extremely frustrated, politically marginalized, disempowered, and they see no prospect. This is why in countries that look reasonably stable, you still see thousands and thousands of them going through the Sahara Desert, trekking down to try to reach Europe, because the options at home don't look good. There's nowhere else in the neighborhood where you can go to try to sustain yourself. And that is really a very, very serious security threat for the majority of African countries. And I think until we begin to look at a little bit more equitable development, that's going to be serious. In my view, the economic frameworks that the majority of these countries is using is simply wrong. Then, of course, there's the issue of state fragility. The state, for a lot of the reasons that I talked about earlier across the continent, extremely fragile. Institutions are very weak. The state is unable to deliver basic social services. It has a lot of difficulties holding the population together. So they tend to turn to a lot of negative tendencies to stay in power. Not only does that contribute towards internal instability, but it also makes Africa very ripe for external influences. Part of the reason why the Sahel and Mali became an entry point as Libya was imploding and breaking down, where did a lot of the people go? Some of the Islamists there, they moved south, they went into Mali, they went into Niger, and so on, and began to spread a lot of the extremism and violence across that entire region. The worst examples, of course, of state fragility is in South Sudan and Somalia. But overall, the weakness of the state, I think, is a very key issue. I've taken way too much time, but let me conclude with just a few words on the US and security in Africa. What do you do about all of this? What posture should the US take with respect to security threats in Africa, whether you agree with me or not on the projections? And indeed, one can do the analysis and come at it a lot of different ways. I think there's no question that the US needs to be engaged and must be engaged very, very intensively in Africa. Not only because of what people refer to as the moral imperative, but also because at the end of the day, the stability of Africa has a very direct relationship to US national security interest. If things break out there, whether you like it or not, whether it is the refugee situation or a civil strife or a breakdown in law and order, as in the case of South Sudan, ultimately people turn to the US to either go in directly and do something, or through the United Nations, or even supporting organizations like the African Union. Almost all of them turn to the US as the major power in that area. So there's the global threat dimension. If you don't intervene earlier on to try to influence a positive direction, you will have to intervene in a more costly way at the end to try to contain a worsening situation. And I think we also then need to pause and reflect on the question about what current US policy is doing. Are you working in the right direction in helping influence these countries positively? The resources, because the US is doing a lot. You have AFRICOM in Africa for some of the same purposes here. I think the overall assessment is that the US is doing a lot, putting in a lot of money and resources. There are a lot of initiatives in addition to AFRICOM. USAID is putting in a lot of money as well, but it could do better. Definitely could do better in a whole lot of areas. Let me just point to 6 very general points. Point number 1, I think we need to make a lot of effort to try to develop a much more coherent approach. Looking at it from the outside, the impression one gets is that we have very compartmentalized approaches. DoD goes its own way. USAID has some programs and ideas. The Department of State has a lot of different issues. FBI has interest perhaps on dealing with regional and transnational crimes and so on. But it is unclear if these are the result of some overall agreed policy more generally, whether it is Africa as a whole or sub-regions that determine how each one of the different parts play their role. And I think that is a very important point. The little time I spent within the US government, I got the impression that there's very little talking to each other. Secondly, internal contradictions, which result from the first point. And I'll give a very crass example. You will find in a number of different situations where Department of State is saying one thing, we don't agree with this, we don't like this and the other, the military is engaging. It's doing a few things with the same group. And that sends contradictory messages. And you know, a lot of these leaders really listen a lot more to the DOD people, partly because a lot of them have military affiliations, secondly because security is paramount to them for some of the reasons I pointed out earlier. Thirdly, you may not look at it that way, but DOD, the military sort of engagements actually give them a lot more money and hardware than they get from the other parts of the U.S. government. So I think some of these internal contradictions need to be resolved, and one way of resolving it is if you have sort of a coherent, streamlined way of making policy. Third, oftentimes it appears that the U.S. is driven more by its geopolitical security strategy in the region. So we engage a lot in the Horn of Africa because we are concerned about a whole number of things in the Indian Ocean, about access to the Middle East, about the potential of Al-Shabaab creating problems, and so on, which is fair enough. You have to take that into account, and you can't operate in an area unless you can determine that there are actually some critical interests. But if you think about some of what I've said earlier and look at where your security challenges are coming from, that kind of approach that is driven almost exclusively by your geopolitical interest misses out on a whole lot of things that have a lot of impact on security. Which leads me to my fourth point, that one needs to develop a very long-term perspective. A very difficult thing for governments and international organizations to do. We agree on it in theory, that you can't be shaping up your engagement on the basis of 1-2 years. You need to look 20, 30 years down the line, because changing some of these things will take a very, very long time. You may not even be able to see results. So one needs to develop a very long-term perspective. The policy framework that I was talking about earlier needs to be one that looks at Africa 20, 30 years from now. What would we, how do they see themselves? How can we help them to get to where they need to go? So really that long-term perspective is extremely important. And then fifth, democracy is a very critical element. I think really, the parts of the government that deal with democracy, and I think even the military part has a lot to do with that, democratization within the military itself. And if you look at the issues about some of the things happening in Uganda, for example, which is replicated in a number of different countries, your engagement should go back to the principles of democracy and accountability in determining, do we continue here, and what leverage do we have to try to ensure that they change directions? And finally, I think we have to be guided by a very, very strong desire to build resilient societies. Long-term strategy to support the development, the building of institutions, the issue of equitable development, questions of accountable government, and strong, effective states. Just end with a little anecdote. I was in Kampala a week and a half ago, walking down in my part of town. And as I drove by, you will see all nationalities of Africa in that part of Kampala. You have a huge number of Somalis, you've got Ethiopians and Eritreans and South Sudanese and Congolese and what have you. In some ways, a very positive sign, because it means they see Uganda as a stable place, everybody wants to go there, the government and the people of Uganda are very receptive to them, and so on and so on. But then what starts worrying one is that part of the reason people are going through is because the state of Uganda, the government is really failing in a lot of different ways. There's no control on immigration. All you need is probably $100 or so, you can buy yourself a passport in the country. People move in freely. And at the same time, in fact, part of what triggered me to think about that was that same week in Kenya, they had arrested a Somali student, medical student, I believe, in one of the universities. Apparently, he was involved in recruiting people for terrorist work in Kenya and in Uganda. And in Uganda, they took 2 students who were related to him. And I started wondering, does the Uganda authority have the ability to even follow up on this? monitor and determine who is coming, who is going, what are they doing, and so on. And a lot of that has to do with the nature of the state and how strong it is. When you have a very, very corrupt system, very dysfunctional, doesn't work at all, your ability to maintain security is significantly compromised. So that is my 1 cent's worth here. I really do think, yes, the security part is extremely important, but you have to contextualize the military and security dimension in assisting, supporting the development of a more stable and resilient Africa. Thank you.